A grieving widow embarks on a journey with her devoted manservant. But along the way, unexpected emotions arise that neither of them is prepared for. And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Jenkins estate, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Laura Jenkins stood in the grand foyer, her hand resting on a mahogany table that cost more than most people's cars. At 62, she carried herself with the practiced grace of old money, but her eyes betrayed a weariness that wealth couldn't mask. The mansion staff worked silently around her, carrying luggage to the waiting car. Each piece of designer luggage represented a fraction of her life, carefully curated over decades of marriage to Charles Jenkins, now 3 years deceased. The crystal chandelier above caught the light, spreading rainbow reflections across the walls, a display that once delighted her, but now felt hollow. "The car is ready, Mrs. Jenkins," Elijah announced from the doorway. At 45, he stood tall in his perfectly pressed uniform, his dark skin contrasting with the crisp white of his collar. His eyes, kind but watchful, noted how Laura's fingers trembled as she adjusted her pearl necklace. Laura nodded, taking one last look at the grand staircase where family portraits hung in gilded frames. "It feels like a museum, doesn't it, Elijah? All these beautiful things, but no life in them anymore." Her voice carried the slight tremor of someone used to speaking their truth. In the car, Elijah adjusted the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of Laura as she stared out the window. The distance between the front and back seats seemed both too vast and too intimate. He had served the Jenkins family for 15 years, watching Laura retreat further into herself after Charles's death. This spontaneous decision to travel the Pacific coast had surprised everyone, himself included. The drive to the coast took them through changing landscapes, from manicured suburbs to rugged coastline. Laura barely spoke, her designer sunglasses hiding her eyes, but Elijah noticed how her posture changed as they approached the ocean. Subtle straightening of her spine, fingers uncurling from their tight grip on her handbag. They arrived in Seacliff just as the afternoon light turned golden. The small coastal town was everything their privileged enclave wasn't. Weathered, authentic, alive with the smell of salt and seafood. Laura stepped out of the car, her expensive shoes sinking slightly into the sand-dusted pavement. The moment she saw the ocean, she stopped. The vast expanse of blue stretched endlessly before her, waves crashing against rocky outcrops with a thunder that demanded attention. Her hand flew to her throat, clutching her pearls like a lifeline. "Mrs. Jenkins?" Elijah moved to her side, concerned by her sudden stillness. "I haven't seen the ocean since Charles and I." She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Their last vacation together had been to the Amalfi Coast, 2 months before the stroke that took him. A strong gust of wind whipped her perfectly styled hair, and for the first time in years, Laura didn't immediately move to fix it. She stood there, letting the wind and salt air mess up her carefully maintained appearance. Elijah watched as something shifted in her expression, subtle but significant, like ice beginning to crack in spring. "Should I take the luggage to the hotel?" he asked, maintaining professional distance despite his growing concern. Laura turned to him, and for a moment, the setting sun illuminated her face, revealing not just the wealthy widow he served, but a woman standing on the edge of something vast and unknown. "No," she said, her voice stronger than before. "Let's just stay here a moment. I want to watch the waves." Elijah nodded, taking his place a respectful distance behind her. As the sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the beach, he observed how Laura's shoulders gradually relaxed, her breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the waves. The distance between them, physical, social, emotional, seemed to shift with each passing moment, like sand reshaping itself under the tide's persistent touch. This was just the beginning, Elijah knew. The real journey would start tomorrow, when Laura would have to navigate a world far removed from her carefully controlled existence. But for now, they stood in silence, servant and employer, both feeling the weight of unspoken words and unexplored possibilities carried on the salt-laden breeze. The morning beach stretched empty before Laura, save for a solitary figure stationed behind an easel near the water's edge. Laura had risen early, surprising Elijah with her request for a morning walk. Now, her expensive walking shoes left precise indentations in the wet sand as she moved closer to the artist. The woman at the easel worked with quick, confident strokes, her gray hair tied back in a loose knot, clothes splattered with paint. Her canvas captured the coastline in bold colors that seemed to vibrate with energy, nothing like the careful landscapes that hung in Laura's mansion. Laura stopped several feet away, watching. The artist's brush moved with a freedom she remembered from long ago, before marriage had transformed her life into a series of social obligations and careful appearances. She could almost feel the weight of her own brushes in her hands, tools she'd packed away after Charles's first disapproving comment about the mess in their formal living room. "You can come closer," the artist called out, not turning from her work. "I don't bite, and the view's better from here." Laura startled at being addressed so directly. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said, her social polish automatically engaging. The artist turned then, revealing a weathered face creased with laugh lines. "Art's meant to be watched while it happens. I'm Maya." She gestured at the space beside her with a paint-stained hand. "You look like you know something about this." "I used to paint," Laura admitted, moving closer. The canvas revealed itself in detail, not just a seascape, but a story told in color and movement. "Years ago, nothing as vivid as this," Maya hummed, adding another bold stroke of blue. "Used to? Art isn't something you stop doing. You just stop letting yourself do it." From his position near the boardwalk, Elijah watched the interaction with growing interest. In 15 years, he'd never seen Laura engage so naturally with a stranger. Her usual careful distance had dissolved in the face of Maya's direct approach. "My husband thought it wasn't suitable," Laura said, then seemed surprised at her own candor. "He preferred we collect art rather than create it." Maya set down her brush, giving Laura her full attention. "And what do you prefer, now that the choice is yours?" The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Laura's hands moved unconsciously, fingers curling as if holding an invisible brush. "I haven't thought about what I prefer in a very long time." "Well, that's a shame," Maya said, reaching into her supply bag. She pulled out a spare brush, holding it out to Laura. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like someone who has a lot to say on canvas." Laura stared at the offered brush as if it might burn her. "I wouldn't know where to begin. Same place we all do, with one stroke." Maya gestured to her spare easel, already set up beside her own. "I always bring an extra setup. Never know when you'll meet someone who needs to remember who they are." Elijah watched as Laura hesitated, her ingrained propriety warring with desire. He could see the moment decision won over doubt. She took the brush, handling it with the care of someone rediscovering a lost treasure. "I am not dressed for painting," she said, looking down at her expensive outfit. Maya laughed, a rich sound that carried across the beach. "Art doesn't care what you're wearing. Here." She handed Laura a paint-stained apron. Protection for the outfit, freedom for the soul. Over the next 2 hours, Elijah observed a transformation. Laura's precise posture softened as she worked. Her carefully styled hair came loose in the ocean breeze. Paint found its way onto her cheeks, her hands, her rolled-up sleeves. She painted with increasing confidence, not speaking, completely absorbed in the process. Maya worked beside her, offering occasional guidance, but mostly letting Laura find her own way back to the language of color and form. The two canvases took shape under the morning sun, Maya's bold interpretation next to Laura's more hesitant, but increasingly confident strokes. Elijah felt something tighten in his chest watching Laura work. In all his years of service, he'd never seen her so unguarded, so present in the moment. The careful mask of the wealthy widow had slipped, revealing the woman beneath, passionate, uncertain, alive. "You've been holding back," Maya said finally, stepping back to look at Laura's canvas. "There's a whole world of color waiting for you to let it out." Laura set down her brush, studying her work. The painting wasn't perfect, proportions slightly off, colors not quite balanced, but it vibrated with something real, something true. I forgot how it felt, she whispered. To create something of my own? Well, Maya said, beginning to pack up her supplies. My studio's just up the beach. Doors always open if you want to remember more. As they walked back to where Elijah waited, Laura's paint-stained hands clutched Maya's business card. She looked younger somehow, energized despite the morning's exertion. Her expensive outfit was spotted with paint, her hair wind-tousled, and yet she seemed more herself than Elijah had ever seen her. Elijah, she said as they reached him, I think I'd like to visit an art supply store. Her voice held a new note, something between excitement and fear, like someone stepping onto unknown ground but determined to continue. Of course, Mrs. Jenkins, he replied, noting how she touched the dried paint on her hands as if to reassure herself it was real. The walls between them shifted slightly, one more brick loosened by the morning's revelations. The coastal fair transformed the boardwalk into a maze of lights, music, and enticing aromas. Laura had insisted they attend, surprising Elijah with her enthusiasm. Now, as evening settled, the usual boundaries between them blurred in the informal atmosphere. You must try this, Laura said, holding out a paper plate of fresh fish tacos. Her voice carried an almost childlike excitement that contrasted sharply with her usual reserve. She dressed down for the occasion, if designer casual could be called down, but the paint stains from her morning's art session still marked her fingers. Elijah hesitated, years of professional training warring with the moment. Mrs. Jenkins, I shouldn't, please, she interrupted, pushing the plate closer. I've watched you serve my meals for 15 years. Just this once, share one with me. He accepted the plate carefully, aware of the looks they drew from passing fairgoers. A wealthy white woman and her black servant sharing street food at a local fair. It wasn't the sort of scene that went unnoticed, even in 2024. The tacos were indeed excellent, fresh and flavorful in a way the mansion's gourmet meals rarely achieved. Laura watched him eat with obvious pleasure, her own plate balanced precariously as she attempted to maintain some dignity while handling the messy food. Charles would have hated this, she said suddenly, wiping sauce from her chin with a paper napkin. He believed in maintaining standards at all times. She glanced around at the crowd, the carniva, El Games, the local vendors. But I think this is more real than any of our charity galas ever were. Music drifted from the center of the fair, where locals had set up a dance floor. The band played something with a Latin rhythm, and couples moved together without concern for skill or status. Laura's foot tapped unconsciously to the beat. Do you dance, Elijah? She asked, disposing of their empty plates. He shook his head, taking his usual position slightly behind her. Not appropriate in my position, Mrs. Jenkins. Laura turned to face him fully. In what position is that exactly? Here, away from the mansion and all its rules? She gestured to the dancing couples. Look at them. No one cares about position or propriety. They're just living. Before he could respond, she was moving toward the dance floor, drawn by the music and the infectious joy of the crowd. Elijah watched from the sidelines as she was welcomed into a group of dancers. She moved awkwardly at first, her trained ballroom steps out of place in this setting, but gradually found the rhythm. Elijah felt the familiar weight of invisibility settle over him. The servant at the edges, observing but never participating. Yet something was different tonight. Laura kept glancing his way, her eyes bright with invitation and challenge. Finally, she broke away from the group and approached him. Dance with me, she said, extending her hand. It wasn't quite a request, wasn't quite a command. People will talk, he warned, even as his body shifted toward her. Let them, she replied. I'm tired of living for other people's talk. The first steps were uncertain, both of them hyper-aware of watching eyes. But the music was insistent, the rhythm demanding response. Laura stumbled slightly, and Elijah caught her arm instinctively. The touch sparked something, a shared laugh, a moment of genuine connection. They found their rhythm together, moving from formal distance to something more natural. Laura's expensive shirt came untucked, Elijah's carefully pressed uniform wrinkled with movement. Neither seemed to notice or care. I never knew you could dance like this, Laura said during a particularly energetic turn. There's a lot we don't know about each other, Elijah replied, surprising himself with his candor. 15 years of silence creates many gaps. The music shifted to something slower, and they adjusted automatically, maintaining connection but now able to talk. Around them, other couples moved closer, but Laura and Elijah kept a careful distance. Close enough to dance, far enough to remember who they were. "Tell me something real," Laura said suddenly. Something the perfect servant would never say to his employer. Elijah met her eyes, seeing the challenge there. "I worried about you," he said finally. "After Charles died, watching you disappear into that mansion, into your grief. Sometimes I wanted to say something, to reach out, but there were rules," she finished for him. "Always rules." They danced in silence for a moment, both processing this small breach in their carefully maintained walls. The fair lights played across their faces, casting alternating patterns of light and shadow. "I saw you too," Laura admitted. "All those years, bringing my breakfast, driving my car, standing in corners during parties. I saw how people looked through you, and I did nothing." The honesty hung between them, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, simply true. The music swelled around them. Other dancers laughed and celebrated, but in their small space on the dance floor, something fundamental was shifting. As the song ended, they stepped apart naturally, but the distance between them had changed. They were no longer quite servant and employer, but not quite friends either, suspended in some undefined space between roles. "Thank you for the dance," Laura said formally, her social training reasserting itself. "Thank you for the invitation," Elijah responded, equally formal, but a slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. They made their way off the dance floor, both aware that they'd crossed some invisible line. The rest of the fair spread before them. Games to play, foods to try, experiences to share. But the real adventure had happened in those moments of dance, when pretense fell away and truth emerged in rhythm and movement. The night air carried the salt of the sea and the sweetness of carnival treats. Tomorrow, they would need to face the consequences of these small rebellions against propriety. But for now, they walked side by side, neither leading nor following, through the fairground's transformed landscape. The hotel's private beach section was deserted at this late hour. Laura sat on one of the wooden loungers, her designer nightgown covered by an oversized cardigan. The night air carried a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Elijah found her there, as he had every night since their arrival, though tonight felt different after their dance at the fair. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, maintaining professional courtesy even as he settled onto the lounger next to hers. An unprecedented breach of protocol. "The house is too quiet," Laura said. "Has been since Charles died. Here, at least the waves make noise." She wrapped her cardigan tighter. "Why are you still awake, Elijah?" He considered deflecting with a professional response about ensuring her safety, but the night seemed to demand honesty. Some nights are harder than others to forget certain things. Laura turned to study his profile in the moonlight. "Tell me," she said softly. "Tell me what keeps Elijah Matthews awake at night." He stayed silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of careful silence. "Did you know I had a family once? A wife, a daughter, before I came to work for you and Charles." Laura's breath caught. In 15 years, she'd never asked about his life before the mansion. "What happened?" "Accident. Drunk driver. I was working late. Another wealthy family, another servant's position." His hands clasped together tightly. The police officer who came to the scene saw a black man in an expensive neighborhood and spent 45 minutes questioning me before even mentioning my family's accident. The waves crashed against the shore, filling the heavy silence between them. By the time I got to the hospital, he didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. That's why I took the job with you and Charles. Needed to get away from Atlanta, from the memories, from the guilt. Laura reached across the space between their loungers, her hand hovering uncertainly before touching his clasped ones. "It wasn't your fault," she said quietly. "Wasn't it? I chose work over family. Chose serving other people's children over being with my own." His laugh held no humor. "The irony is I kept doing exactly that, serving other people, their families. Just got better at pretending it didn't hurt." Laura withdrew her hand slowly. I understand something about pretending, she admitted. After Charles died, everyone expected the grieving widow performance. The appropriate tears, the dignified solitude. No one wanted to hear that I was angry too. Angry at him for leaving me. Angry at myself for spending 30 years being exactly what everyone expected and nothing of what I wanted. What did you want? Elijah asked, turning to face her. To paint, to travel, to make mistakes and learn from them. She gestured at the ocean. To sit on a beach at midnight talking to someone who sees me as more than Charles Jenkins' widow. The confession hung between them, too honest to take back, too raw to ignore. I see you, Elijah said simply. I've always seen you, even when I wasn't supposed to look. Laura's hands trembled slightly as she tucked her hair behind her ear. A nervous gesture he'd noticed over years of careful observation. Does it ever get easier? The loneliness. No, he answered honestly. But sometimes you find moments when it hurts less, when someone understands enough of your pain to help you carry it. They sat in companionable silence, watching the moonlight play on the waves. The distance between their loungers seemed both vast and insignificant. My daughter would have been 28 this year, Elijah said suddenly. Sometimes I see young women her age and wonder who she might have become. What was her name? Laura asked softly. Sarah, after my grandmother. He pulled out his wallet, removing a worn photograph. This was her last school picture. Laura took the photo carefully, studying the smiling girl with her father's eyes. She's beautiful, she said, handing it back. Thank you for sharing her with me. Thank you for asking, he replied. Most people avoid the subject of loss. They think silence is kinder than remembrance. They're wrong, Laura said firmly. Silence just makes the ghosts louder. A shooting star streaked across the sky, and they both watched its brief, brilliant passage. I haven't sung since Charles died, Laura confessed. He always said I had a terrible voice, but I used to love it. Used to sing in the shower, in the garden. Silly little things. Sing now, Elijah suggested. The waves won't judge. She laughed softly, but began humming an old jazz standard. Her voice was untrained but sincere, carrying over the sound of the surf. After a moment, Elijah joined in, his rich baritone complementing her hesitant melody. They sang together under the stars, their voices mixing with the ocean's rhythm. In that moment, they weren't employer and employee, weren't divided by race or class or society's expectations. They were just two people sharing their grief, their hope, their humanity. When the song ended, neither spoke immediately. The night had changed something between them, created a connection that went beyond professional boundaries into something more profound and potentially dangerous. We should get some rest, Elijah said finally, standing and automatically extending his hand to help her up. Laura took it, holding on a moment longer than necessary. Thank you, Elijah, for trusting me with your story. With Sarah. Thank you for listening, he replied. And for singing. They walked back to the hotel in silence, both aware that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new expectations. But for now, they had shared something real, something true. The walls between them hadn't crumbled entirely, but they had developed significant cracks, enough to let in the light of understanding and the possibility of more. Le Maison Azure stood as a beacon of old money on the coastline, its blue-tinted windows reflecting the setting sun. Laura had insisted Elijah join her for dinner, not as her servant, but as her companion. He'd resisted initially, but her persistence won out. Now, dressed in one of his rare civilian suits, he sat across from her at a table overlooking the ocean. The maitre d' had raised an eyebrow at seating them together, but hadn't dared refuse Laura Jenkins' request. Still, his disdain showed in small ways. The slight delay in service, the water glasses left unfilled, the whispers to other staff members. The salmon here is excellent, Laura said, trying to maintain normalcy despite the growing tension. She could feel the stares from neighboring tables, hear the murmured conversations behind raised menus. Elijah sat stiffly, his years of service making him acutely aware of every judgmental glance. Perhaps this wasn't the best idea, Mrs. Jenkins. Laura, she corrected quietly. Tonight, I'm just Laura. A waiter approached their table, addressing only Laura while placing their appetizers. "Madam, the chef recommends the wine pairing." He deliberately turned his back to Elijah, as if he didn't exist. Laura's fingers tightened around her napkin. "Please address both of us when you speak to this table." The waiter's face flushed. "Of course, madam. Sir." The last word carried a slight sneer. From 3 tables over, a woman's voice carried clearly. "Really? What is the world coming to? In my day, people knew their place." Elijah's jaw clenched, but he maintained his composure, a skill learned through years of similar situations. Laura, however, had reached her limit. She stood slowly, her chair scraping against the expensive flooring. The restaurant fell silent, all pretense of discreet observation abandoned. Elijah looked up at her, concern evident in his eyes. "Laura," he said softly, "you don't need to." "Yes, I do." Her voice carried clearly in the hushed restaurant. "I've spent too many years being silent." She turned to face the room, her posture straight, her expression determined. "I see you all watching us, whispering behind your menus, making judgments about things you don't understand. I've sat at tables like yours for 30 years, participating in the same quiet bigotry, the same comfortable prejudice." The woman who had commented earlier tried to interrupt. "Now really, this is hardly the place." "This is exactly the place," Laura continued. "Because it's in places like this, elegant restaurants, country clubs, charity galas, where we perpetuate the myth that some people are worth more than others based on nothing more than the color of their skin or the size of their bank account." Elijah stood now too, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "You don't have to fight this battle." She covered his hand with hers, drawing strength from the contact. "Yes, I do. Because I was part of the problem for too long." She addressed the room again. "The man standing beside me has more dignity, more humanity, more worth than all of your judgments combined. He's not my servant tonight. He's my friend. And if that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should examine why." A young couple at a nearby table started applauding, followed by a few others. But many faces remained hostile, uncomfortable with this disruption of their carefully maintained social order. The maitre d' approached, wringing his hands. "Mrs. Jenkins, perhaps it would be best." "We'll be leaving," she interrupted. "But not because we're ashamed or embarrassed. We're leaving because life is too short to spend it in places where love and friendship are considered offensive." She reached for her purse, but Elijah beat her to it, pulling out his own wallet. "Allow me," he said, placing several bills on the table, enough to cover their barely touched meal and a generous tip. It was a small gesture, but a significant one, asserting his own dignity, his right to be more than a recipient of Laura's generosity. As they walked toward the exit, an elderly man stood up from his table, forcing them to stop. For a moment, tension filled the air. Then he extended his hand to Elijah. "My wife and I watched them turn my father away from places like this for 50 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "It's about time someone spoke up." Elijah shook the offered hand, nodding in silent understanding. More diners stood, some in support, others in protest, creating a discord of movement and murmured comments. Outside, the evening air felt clean after the stifling atmosphere of the restaurant. Laura's hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline of confrontation wearing off. "Are you okay?" Elijah asked, genuine concern in his voice. She laughed, a slightly hysterical edge to it. "I just burned about a dozen social bridges back there. Charles would be horrified. And how do you feel about it?" She turned to face him, really looking at him in the fading light. "Free," she said simply. "I feel free." They stood there for a moment, the sound of waves mixing with the muffled discussion still, emanating from the restaurant. The line they'd crossed tonight couldn't be uncrossed. Their relationship had shifted irrevocably from the safety of employer and employee into unknown territory. "There's a burger place down by the pier," Elijah suggested finally. "Much better food, much less judgment." Laura smiled, slipping her arm through his in a gesture that would have been unthinkable just days ago. "Lead the way." They walked together along the boardwalk, leaving behind the whispers and stares of Le Maison Azure. Tomorrow would bring consequences, phone calls from concerned friends, perhaps even social fallout. But tonight, they had stood together, and in doing so, had discovered something stronger than society's expectations: their own truth. The morning sun had barely touched the hotel's marble lobby when James Whitmore III arrived, his tailored suit and commanding presence drawing immediate attention. Laura was returning from her morning painting session with Maya, her clothes speckled with paint, when she saw him standing there. "James," she said, stopping abruptly. Elijah, who had been carrying her art supplies, noticed her sudden tension. "Laura, darling." James crossed the lobby with practiced ease, kissing her cheek as if the past 3 years hadn't happened. "You're looking artistic." His slight pause carried volumes of judgment. "What are you doing here?" Laura asked, unconsciously wiping her paint-stained hands on her pants. "Can a man check on his best friend's widow?" James smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The country club is in an uproar over your little scene at Le Maison Azure. The board members are concerned." Elijah began to step back, falling into his servant's role out of habit, but Laura's hand shot out, gripping his arm. "Elijah stays," she said firmly. James's eyebrows rose slightly. "Of course. How progressive of you." He gestured toward the hotel's upscale bar. "Shall we discuss this somewhere more private?" The bar was empty this early, sunlight streaming through vast windows onto leather chairs and polished wood. James ordered scotch, raising an eyebrow when Laura requested coffee instead. "Charles would be disappointed," he commented. "You always shared his appreciation for fine spirits." "I shared a lot of things with Charles that weren't really me," Laura replied. Elijah stood nearby, not quite part of the conversation, but not excluded either. An uncomfortable middle ground. "That's actually why I'm here." James leaned forward, his voice taking on an intimate tone. "Laura, you're having what the therapists call a delayed grief reaction. Acting out, rejecting your life, pursuing inappropriate relationships." His eyes flicked briefly to Elijah. "Don't," Laura warned, but James continued. "The board is willing to overlook this temporary lapse in judgment. Your position in society, your charitable works, your influence, these things matter. Charles worked his entire life to build that legacy." "Charles's legacy," Laura repeated softly. "What about my legacy, James? What about my life?" "This isn't your life, Laura." James gestured around them. "Paint-stained clothes, public scenes, consorting with servants? This is a fantasy, and it's time to wake up." Elijah shifted slightly, and Laura could sense his discomfort. The word servant hung in the air between them, reminding them of boundaries they'd begun to forget. "I'm offering you a way back," James continued. "The summer house in Newport is ready. The right people, the right environment. You can recover your equilibrium there. Remember who you are? And who am I, James?" Laura's voice was quiet but steady. "You're Charles Jenkins' widow, a leader in our social circle, a woman of substance and propriety." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "You're the woman Charles loved, the woman I've watched over these past 3 years, hoping you'd find your way back to us." The implications in his touch, his words, were clear. James had been waiting, watching, hoping to step into Charles's place in her life. Elijah moved then, unable to remain still. "Mrs. Jenkins, shall I prepare the car?" The formal address felt like a step backward, and Laura flinched slightly at hearing it. "No, il était. Please stay." James withdrew his hand, sighing theatrically. "Laura, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. Think about your position, your responsibilities. Think about what Charles would want." "Charles is dead," Laura said flatly. "And I'm tired of living for what other people want." "Are you?" James's voice took on a harder edge. "Then tell me, what do you want? To throw away everything you've built? To become a scandal, a cautionary tale? To pursue some foolish infatuation with a man who serves you breakfast?" Elijah stiffened, but before he could respond, Laura stood. "You don't get to speak about him that way. You don't get to judge what I've found here." "And what exactly have you found?" James stood as well, his height allowing him to tower over her. "A few days of rebellion? A romantic fantasy? Wake up, Laura. This isn't real. It's the most real thing I've felt since Charles died." She took a step back, bumping into Elijah, who had moved protectively closer. James watched this interaction with calculating eyes. The board meets next week. They'll expect you there, composed and appropriate. This little adventure needs to end. Or what? Laura challenged. Or the charitable foundation loses its primary funding. The scholarships, the community programs, all the good work Charles believed in. Are you willing to sacrifice that for this? He gestured between Laura and Elijah. The threat hung in the air, heavy with implications. Laura felt Elijah's presence behind her, solid and real, but James's words had found their mark. The foundation helped hundreds of people, provided opportunities and support to those who needed it most. You have 3 days, James said, finishing his scotch. I'll have the Newport house prepared. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Laura? Charles kept a detailed diary. Are you sure you want certain entries about your private struggles made public? After he left, Laura sank back in her chair, the weight of his threats settling over her. Elijah remained standing. The professional distance between them suddenly felt like a chasm. He's right about some things, Laura said finally. I have responsibilities. People depend on that foundation. You have responsibilities to yourself too, Elijah replied quietly. Laura looked up at him, seeing the careful mask he'd worn for 15 years sliding back into place. Elijah, I should prepare for the day's duties, Mrs. Jenkins. He stepped back, each movement measured and professional. She watched him go, feeling the warmth of the past few days giving way to cold reality. James's visit had reminded them both of who they were supposed to be, of the roles they were expected to play. The question now was whether they would accept those roles or fight for something more authentic, something that carried both promise and risk. The sun continued to rise outside, casting long shadows across the bar's polished floor. Laura sat alone, paint drying on her clothes, feeling the weight of choice pressing down on her. Behind her, the ghost of Charles Jenkins seemed to watch and wait, while ahead, an uncertain future beckoned. Maya's studio sat perched on weathered stilts above the beach, a haven of creative chaos that stood in stark contrast to the ordered luxury of Laura's world. After James's visit, she found herself drawn here, seeking something solid in a world that suddenly felt unstable. You look like you're carrying the weight of the ocean, Maya commented, setting up a fresh canvas. The morning light filtered through salt-streaked windows, casting patterns across the paint SP. Laddered floor. Laura picked up a brush, turning it between her fingers. Have you ever had to choose between who you are and who everyone needs you to be? Every day until I stopped letting them choose for me. Maya adjusted her easel. Art has a way of showing us our truth, if we're brave enough to look. Laura began to paint, her strokes aggressive, almost angry. Colors clashed on the canvas. Deep blues fighting against harsh reds, shadows threatening to overwhelm light. She worked without conscious thought, letting emotions guide her hands. Meanwhile, across town, Elijah sat in a small coffee shop, facing Marcus, an old friend from his college days who'd settled in the coastal town years ago. You're in deep, brother, Marcus said, studying Elijah's expression. I haven't seen you look this torn since Sarah. Elijah stared into his coffee. It's not what you think. No. Marcus leaned back. I saw you two at the fair. At that restaurant. That's not employer and employee. That's something else entirely. Something impossible, Elijah muttered. Like a black man getting his law degree in 1990s Georgia. Marcus raised an eyebrow. We've spent our whole lives hearing impossible. Since when do you listen? Back in the studio, Laura's painting had taken shape, a turbulent seascape where waves crashed against unseen barriers. Maya watched silently, recognizing the therapy happening on canvas. James thinks I'm having a breakdown, Laura said finally, stepping back from her work. Maybe he's right. Looks more like a breakthrough to me. Maya pointed to the light breaking through the storm clouds in Laura's painting. See that? That's hope fighting through fear. I have responsibilities, Laura whispered, echoing James's words. People depend on me. And who do you depend on? Maya challenged. Who holds Laura Jenkins when the weight gets too heavy? In the coffee shop, Marcus pressed on. Remember what you told me when I wanted to quit law school? Fear of falling shouldn't stop you from flying. This is different, Elijah protested. I'm her servant. I serve her breakfast, drive her car, stand in corners during parties, and share her pain under the stars? Dance with her at local fairs? Stand beside her while she faces down bigots in fancy restaurants? Marcus shook his head. Those aren't a servant's actions, E. Those are a man's choices. Laura added final touches to her painting, the strokes becoming more deliberate, more controlled. The foundation helps so many people, she said. James could destroy all that. Or you could lead it in a new direction, Maya suggested. Real change doesn't come from safe choices made in boardrooms. It comes from people brave enough to live their truth. She gestured to Laura's canvas. Look at what you've created here. There's passion in those waves, strength in those storm clouds. That's not Charles Jenkins' proper widow speaking. That's you, the real you. Elijah stood, pacing the coffee shop. I can't ask her to give up everything. Her position, her foundation, her entire world. Seems to me she's already choosing to give those things up, Marcus observed. Question is, are you brave enough to catch her when she jumps? I lost everything once, Elijah said quietly. My wife, my Sarah. I'm not sure I'm strong enough to risk that kind of pain again. Sarah would want you to be happy, Marcus said gently. She was just like you, always fighting for what was right, even when it was hard. Laura cleaned her brushes, studying her finished work. The storm on her canvas raged, but through the chaos, a path emerged, narrow, dangerous, but clear. I spent 30 years being Charles's perfect wife, she told Maya. I forgot how to be Laura. And now? Maya asked. Now I'm remembering. It's terrifying and exhilarating, and she touched the canvas where light broke through the clouds. And possibly worth everything. Across town, Marcus stood to leave. You know what your problem is, E? You're so used to standing in corners, you've forgotten how to stand in the light. Elijah absorbed this, remembering Laura's voice at the restaurant. He's not my servant tonight, he's my friend. What if it's not enough? He asked quietly. What if we lose everything for nothing? What if you don't try and spend the rest of your life wondering? Marcus countered. Some things are worth the risk, brother. Some people are worth the fall. Laura packed up her supplies, the newly finished painting drying on its easel. Maya watched her with knowing eyes. Whatever you decide, Maya said, make sure it's your choice. Not Charles's, not James's, not society's. Yours. As Laura left the studio, her painting spoke of storms weathered and light breaking through. Across town, Elijah walked along the shore, Marcus's words echoing in his mind. Both felt the weight of impending decisions, of paths diverging, of truths that could no longer be ignored. 3 days. James's deadline hung over them like gathering storm clouds. But perhaps, like in Laura's painting, there was light waiting to break through, if they were brave enough to face the storm together. The hotel suite's balcony had become Laura's impromptu studio. Canvases leaned against the railing, paint supplies scattered across the expensive outdoor furniture. 2 days remained until James's deadline, and Laura painted as if possessed, trying to capture something she couldn't quite name. Elijah found her there at sunset, brush in hand, totally absorbed. She'd changed from her designer clothes into paint-stained overalls Maya had lent her. Her hair was tied back carelessly, streaks of blue and gold paint decorating her forearms. Mrs. Jenkins, he said formally, then corrected himself. Laura. She turned, and he saw the intensity in her eyes, the same look she'd had at Le Maison Azure, when she'd stood up to defend them both. I needed to get this out, she explained, gesturing to the canvas before her. The painting showed 2 figures on a beach at night. One stood in formal attire, rigid and proper, while the other wore simple clothes and moved with freedom. Between them, a dance was beginning, hands reaching across social divides, feet leaving prints in the sand. The sky above them swirled with stars and possibility. It's us, he said quietly. At the fair. Yes. She added another stroke, deepening the shadows between the figures. I've been thinking about what James said, about Charles's legacy, about my responsibilities. Elijah moved closer, studying the painting, The formal figure was beginning to shed its rigid posture, while the free figure offered strength and support. "And what have you decided?" "I'm not done deciding." She rinsed her brush, choosing a different color. "But I'm done hiding. Look." She gestured to other canvases propped against the wall. One showed the restaurant scene, faces in shadow except for spots of light where support had emerged. Another captured their midnight conversation on the beach, the stars above reflecting in the water below. Each painting told a piece of their story, raw and honest and undeniable. "You've captured everything," he said, moving between the canvases. "Not everything." She turned to a blank canvas, larger than the others. This one is for what comes next. But I can't seem to start it." Elijah watched her hand hover over the white surface, trembling slightly. Without thinking, he stepped forward, covering her hand with his. "Maybe," he suggested softly, "it needs both of us." She looked up at him, paintbrush suspended between them. "You paint?" "No," he admitted, "but I understand blank canvases. The fear of making that first mark, the weight of possibility." Together, they touched brush to canvas, making a single bold stroke across the white surface. The line was imperfect, wavering wear. Their hands had shaken, but it was real. "I used to watch you," Laura said, adding another stroke. "All those years in the mansion. The way you moved so carefully contained so much. Like you were painting yourself into smaller and smaller spaces." "We both did that," he replied. "Lived in the boxes others built for us." She worked as they talked, the painting taking shape beneath her hands. A road emerged, winding toward an uncertain horizon. On either side, the familiar shapes of their past lives. The mansion, the servants' quarters, the weight of tradition, began to fade into mist. "I'm scared," she admitted, adding shadows to the road's edges. "Not of losing the foundation or the money or even my place in society. I'm scared of wanting something so much it hurts." Elijah's hand found hers again, steadying the brush. "What do you want, Laura?" She turned to face him fully, paintbrush dripping color onto the expensive balcony tiles. "I want to paint without hiding, to laugh without checking if it's appropriate, to dance without counting the steps." She took a shaky breath. "I want to love without asking permission." The word love hung between them, too big for the space, too real to take back. "James arrives tomorrow," Elijah said quietly, "to take you back to Newport, back to safety." "Is it safety?" She turned back to the canvas, adding storm clouds gathering at the edges of the road. "Or is it just another kind of prison?" He watched her work, seeing how each stroke carried the weight of decision. The road and the painting stretched toward light, but the journey looked difficult and certain. "Sarah used to draw," he said suddenly. "Nothing as good as this, but she loved it. Her mother, my wife, worried it would distract from her studies. But I used to sit with her while she drew, watching her create whole worlds on paper." Laura paused, brush suspended. "What happened to her drawings?" "I kept them. Every one. They're in a box in my quarters at the mansion." His voice caught. "Sometimes, late at night, I look at them and wonder what she would think of the man I've become. The choices I've made." Laura added a figure to the road in her painting, solitary but standing straight, facing the horizon. "And what would she think?" "She'd tell me to be brave," he said softly, "to remember that love is worth the risk." Laura added a second figure to the road, standing close to the first. "James threatened to expose parts of Charles's diary," she said. "Things about my private struggles. He meant the depression, the anxiety pills, the times I couldn't be the perfect wife." "Are you ashamed of those struggles?" "No," she realized, straightening. "They're part of who I am, part of how I got here." The sun had set fully now, but they worked by the balcony lights, adding detail to the painting. The road took on texture, the figures gained definition. The future beckoned with both shadow and light. "Whatever you decide," Elijah said finally, "know that these past days have been real. What we've shared, what we've discovered, it's real." Laura put down her brush, studying their creation. The painting showed a journey beginning, two figures stepping out of shadow into possibility. Behind them, the weight of the past dissolved into memory. Ahead, the road disappeared into light. Help me move these inside, she said, gathering her supplies. Tomorrow comes soon enough. They worked together, handling each canvas carefully, preserving the story they told. The last one, the road stretching forward, they placed where it would catch the morning light. Before Elijah could step back into his professional role, Laura caught his hand. Paint transferred between their palms, marking them both. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing me what courage looks like." He squeezed her hand once, then let go. Tomorrow would bring James, would bring choices, would bring consequences. But tonight, they had painted their truth, had named their possibilities, had dared to imagine a road leading somewhere new. The paint was still wet on the canvas, colors mixing and merging like the boundaries between them, creating something neither had planned, but both had helped create. The hotel's private lounge felt too small for the weight of the moment. James arrived precisely at noon, his crisp suit and confident stride a reminder of the world Laura had left behind. The Newport house keys dangled from his fingers like a promise or a threat. "I trust you've come to your senses," he said, settling into a leather armchair. "The car is waiting." Laura stood by the window, still in her paint-stained clothes, her newly finished canvases arranged around the room. "Actually, I wanted you to see something first." James's eyes swept over the paintings, his expression tightening. "More of your artistic expression? More of my truth." She gestured to each canvas in turn. The fair, the restaurant, the midnight conversations. "I'm not having a breakdown, James. I'm finally waking up." "Laura, darling," his voice carried practiced patience. "This little adventure has been charming, but it's time to return to reality." Reality? She picked up the last painting, the road stretching toward light. "What's real, James? The charity galas where we pretend to care about causes while judging everyone's clothes? The social circles where kindness is measured in tax-deductible donations?" "The foundation does good work," he countered. "Real work, helping real people." "Yes, it does." Laura set the painting down carefully. "And it will continue to do so. Under my leadership, my way." James stood, his composure cracking slightly. "You're not thinking clearly. This relationship with your servant has clouded your judgment." "His name is Elijah," Laura said quietly. "And he's shown me more truth in these few days than I've seen in years of society luncheons." "Ah yes, Elijah Matthews." James's voice took on a strange edge. "Shall we talk about truth, Laura? Shall we discuss what your precious Elijah hasn't told you?" The door opened, and Elijah himself entered, stopping short at the scene before him. "Mrs. Jenkins, I heard voices." "Perfect timing," James smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Laura, did your faithful companion ever mention that we've met before? Long before you hired him?" Laura turned to Elijah, seeing the shock on his face. "What is he talking about?" "Tell her, Elijah," James pressed. "Tell her about Atlanta. About the night your family died. About who was driving the other car." The silence that followed felt endless. Laura looked between them, seeing recognition dawn on Elijah's face, followed by something like horror. "It was you," Elijah whispered. "The drunk driver. They said he was too wealthy to prosecute, that he had connections." "James?" Laura's voice shook. "Tell me he's wrong." "It was an accident," James said smoothly. "A tragic accident, settled out of court. I tried to make amends, arranged for job recommendations, made sure he landed somewhere safe. Somewhere he could be protected." "Protected?" Laura's hands clenched. "You mean controlled. You helped him get the job with us to keep him quiet." "I did what was necessary." James straightened his cufflinks. "Just as I'm doing now." "So, Elijah, shall we discuss your continued employment? Your comfortable position? All the things you could lose by encouraging this inappropriate situation?" Elijah stood very still, years of contained rage and grief visible in his rigid posture. "You killed my family. I gave you a new life," James corrected. "A good position, a respected household. Don't throw it away for some misguided infatuation." Laura moved then, placing herself between them. "You knew," she said to James. "All these years, watching Elijah serve at our parties, stand in our corners, and you knew what you'd taken from him." "I gave him purpose," James insisted. "Structure. A place in the world. You gave him a cage, Laura's voice rose. Just like the one you're trying to give me. Control wrapped in kindness. Prison disguised as protection. Laura, be reasonable. Reasonable? She laughed, a harsh sound. Like you were reasonable the night you killed his wife and daughter? Like you're being reasonable now, threatening us both with destruction if we don't play our assigned roles. The foundation, James reminded her. Charles's legacy, your reputation. Are you willing to sacrifice everything for a man who's been lying to you since the day you hired him? Laura turned to Elijah, seeing the war of emotions on his face. Did you know? When you came to work for us, did you know about James? No. Elijah's voice was raw. I learned later, overheard him at a party. By then, he gestured helplessly. By then the job was all I had left. I couldn't risk losing your safe harbor, James finished smoothly. Can't risk losing it now either, I imagine. So let's all be sensible. Laura will return to Newport, resume her proper place. You'll continue your duties at the mansion. Everything returns to normal. Normal. Laura picked up her painting of the road ahead. This is normal, James. This is real. Two people finding truth together, healing together. She faced him fully. I'm not going to Newport. The foundation will continue under my direction, but with new priorities, new leadership. You're making a mistake, James warned. Charles's diary. Publish it, Laura interrupted. Let everyone read about my struggles, my pain, my journey to this moment. I'm not ashamed anymore. And you? James turned to Elijah. Are you willing to lose everything again? Your position, your security, your carefully constructed peace. Elijah looked at Laura, then back at James. I lost everything the night you killed my family. What I found here with Laura, that's not something you can take away. Not anymore. James's composure finally cracked. This is absurd. You're both being ridiculous. Laura, think about get out, she said quietly. Get out of this hotel. Get out of my foundation. Get out of our lives. You'll regret this, he promised, moving toward the door. Both of you. No, Laura replied, reaching for Elijah's hand. The only thing I regret is how long it took me to understand what really matters. After James left, the silence stretched between them. Finally, Elijah spoke. I should have told you. About James, about knowing. Yes, you should have, Laura agreed. But I understand why you couldn't. She squeezed his hand. No more secrets now. No more hiding. They stood together, surrounded by paintings that told their story. Past, present, and the possibility of future. The road ahead looked uncertain, but at least now they could face it honestly together. What happens next? Elijah asked softly. Laura looked at their joined hands, paint stains mixing between them. We make our own normal, she said. We paint our own path. Outside, waves crashed against the shore, their rhythm a reminder that some forces couldn't be contained, some truths couldn't be denied, and some loves were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in colors Laura had only recently learned to truly see. She stood in Maya's studio one last time, surrounded by the paintings that chronicled her journey from Charles Jenkins' widow to herself. So, Maya said, arranging the canvases for the small local gallery showing they planned. Are you ready for this? Before Laura could answer, the studio door opened and Elijah entered. He'd abandoned his uniform entirely now, dressed in casual clothes that spoke of his own transformation. Their eyes met, carrying the weight of everything they'd learned, lost, and gained in the past weeks. The foundation board is assembled at the hotel, he said. James called an emergency meeting. Laura nodded, touching the last painting sheet completed, the one of the road stretching toward light. Let them wait. This matters more. The gallery space Maya had arranged was small but perfect. Local artists and townspeople mingled with several foundation board members who'd arrived early, curious about the scandal brewing around Laura Jenkins. The paintings told their story in chronological order, from the first beach scene to the final revelation. Mrs. Jenkins, one of the board members, approached, her voice careful. These paintings, they're quite extraordinary. Laura, she corrected gently. Just Laura now. She gestured to the paintings. This is who I am, who I've become. And this, She reached for Elijah's hand. "Is who we are together." The whispers started immediately, but they were different from the ones at Le Maison Azure. These carried notes of understanding, of recognition. The paintings had done what words couldn't. Shown the humanity beneath the social constraints, the truth beneath the pretense. James arrived last, flanked by his lawyers. He stopped short at the gallery entrance, seeing the final painting, one Laura had completed just that morning. It showed three figures, a young woman and a small girl, radiant and free, reaching down from a star-filled sky toward a man who was finally looking up, finally reaching back. "Sarah," Elijah whispered, his voice catching. "And Marie. I hope I did them justice," Laura said softly. "I worked from the photo you showed me, but I tried to capture their spirits, not just their faces." James moved closer, his practiced composure cracking as he studied the painting. "You can't, this isn't. This is exactly what art is for," Laura addressed the gathered crowd. "To speak truth, to heal wounds, to bridge divides." She squared her shoulders. "The Jenkins Foundation is changing direction. Our new mission focuses on arts education in underserved communities, on healing through creativity, on breaking down the barriers that separate us." "The board won't stand for this," James protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually," the board member who'd spoken earlier stepped forward, "we've been reviewing the foundation's direction. Laura's vision, it has merit, real impact, real change." Other board members nodded, moved by the story the paintings told, by the truth they couldn't deny. James looked around, seeing his control slipping away. "You killed my family," Elijah said quietly, facing James. "But you don't get to kill my future. Not anymore." Laura squeezed his hand, feeling the years of pain, of silence beginning to heal. "The Foundation's first project," she announced, "will be establishing art therapy programs for grief counseling, in honor of Sarah and Marie Matthews." The elderly man from Le Maison Azure stepped forward. "My wife and I would like to make the first donation." He looked at James. "Some debts can never be repaid, but perhaps they can be transformed into something healing." James stood alone now, his power dissolving in the face of truth painted in color and light. "Charles wouldn't have wanted this." He tried one last time. "Charles isn't here," Laura replied. "But I am. Finally completely here." She turned to the crowd. "This gallery showing isn't just about art. It's about transformation, about having the courage to step off the prescribed path and find your own way, about loving deeply enough to face truth, no matter how difficult." She led them through the paintings, telling their story, the fair, the dance, the midnight conversations. When she reached the final painting, she paused. Sarah and Marie Matthews died because of wealth and privilege wielded without conscience. Their deaths created ripples that brought Elijah into my life, that led to this moment. We can't change the past, but we can choose how it shapes our future. Elijah stood before the painting of his family, tears falling freely now. Sarah loved to draw, he told the silent crowd. She saw beauty everywhere, even in the hard things. Especially in the hard things. Laura released his hand long enough to retrieve something from behind the gallery desk. A worn box full of children's drawings. "These belong on these walls too," she said. Sarah's art, showing us the way. As they hung the drawings, bright, hopeful pictures from a child long gone. The mood in the gallery shifted. Board members moved closer, asking questions, offering support. Local artists welcomed Laura as one of their own. And James, watching his carefully constructed world crumble, finally saw the weight of his actions reflected in a child's crayon drawings of the family he destroyed. "The foundation meeting," he said stiffly, "is canceled. I'll have my resignation letter delivered tomorrow." No one tried to stop him as he left. His departure felt like a cleansing breath, making room for something new to grow. Maya appeared with champagne, passing glasses to everyone. "To new beginnings," she proposed. "To truth," Laura added, looking at her paintings, her journey from imprisoned to free. "To Sarah and Marie," Elijah said softly, "who taught me that love doesn't end, it just changes form." As the gallery buzzed with conversation and possibility, Laura and Elijah stood before the final painting. the road stretching toward light, now hung beside Sarah's drawings. Their hands found each other naturally, paint stains and calluses telling their own story of work and transformation. "What happens now?" someone asked. Laura looked at Elijah, seeing in his eyes the same mix of fear and hope she felt. "Now," she said, "we paint the next chapter together." The ocean crashed beyond the gallery walls, its rhythm familiar now. A reminder that some forces couldn't be contained, some loves couldn't be denied, and some journeys, though they began in loss and loneliness, could end in finding home in the most unexpected places. Above them, in the painting, Sarah and Marie smiled down from their star-filled sky, blessing a future their deaths had paradoxically made possible. A future where love broke through barriers, truth healed old wounds, and two people found the courage to step off their prescribed paths and create something new, something real, something entirely their own.